We're going to start off with something pretty simple here. If you have not seen or played Undertale, and you plan to, I highly recommend that you do so. It's hard to explain why without spoiling, but that's kind of the point, isn't it? In order to fully and properly experience a game like this, it is my opinion that you need to walk into it as blind as possible. And if you don't, then you simply won't get the same experience that you could or you should. It is a game that is definitely a no men policy, aka no mentioning, as opposed to just no spoilers. So this video will of course be spoiling the hell out of everything. Please keep that in mind. One of the first things I was asked to talk about is why I'll never play Undertale again. I actually mentioned this on stream more than once, and I have mentioned it on my Tumblr, I've mentioned it on my Twitter, I've mentioned it during the actual playthrough, and people have taken that as an insult, and that's logical to do so. I mean, how many times have I replayed FF6, for God's sakes? But it is not an insult in any way, shape, or form. It is, in fact, one of the highest compliments I can give this game. I will never play this game again. Explaining why is somewhat difficult. But simply put, due to the nature of the game and how the game works, playing the game again would require resetting. Resetting my save files and undoing all that I have accomplished thus far. That would involve ruining their happy ending. If you start up the game after having fully accomplished the true pacifist ending, aka the best ending, then you will actually get a message from Flowey himself who will basically say, please don't reset the game. They've earned their happy ending. Let them rest. Let them enjoy it. And I am inclined to allow that. So I did not replay Undertale for this playthrough, although I did watch several other playthroughs for this for this rumination, excuse me. I also watched my own playthrough for this rumination. I think this is a good time to discuss hype, actually. This is topical for me when I'm recording this, because No Man's Sky is a thing that was recently a problem, along with a few other games that have come out in the recent years, but that's just the most recent one, where hype machine is like, oh my god, it's super hyped, and then it would end up being a disappointment. Now, how does this relate to Undertale? By sheer happenstance, I slid under the door on Undertale. Or, to put more accurately, Undertale slid under the door for me. I knew it existed, but everything I had heard had been from what I now know to be the Genocide route. And I basically looked at it and said, that's not my thing, and walked away. And I didn't hear the massive hype-mongering that was surrounding it. I wasn't even aware that it was in a demo format before the game came out for, I think, 2 years. Something like that. It's been around for a while. And quite a few people were very excited about it, and when it came out, apparently a lot of people were even more excited about it. There was quite a bit of a hype machine centered around it. I experienced none of that. And I think this is probably the biggest reason why I talk against hype nowadays. Do keep in mind I am saying hype, not hoip. I utilize the two different terms to describe different things. Hype is artificially generated external interest in a game, which may or may not be valid. Hoip is when you are personally very excited about something because it's something that you're really into, or there's something you hope is going to be very good. Internalized excitement, if you will. Hype is almost universally a bad thing, and I think Undertale shows clearly why. You either have a situation like Watch Dogs or No Man's Sky or a dozen other games, where it comes out and you look at it and it's like, this did not live up to my expectations, or at best, it will live up to your expectations. Or you have a situation like Undertale, where the absence of hype increased my enjoyment of the game. I walked into this game almost completely blind. You can find my playthrough. It's actually on this channel, not the other channel. And if you just go looking for it, it's like a 5 or 6 part playthrough. Pretty short. It's a fairly short game. Obviously, I only went through the true pacifist playthrough. And it's funny because at the beginning of that, people were saying, I was like, okay, I'll let you guys decide because I was streaming it. Should I let the stream decide my actions? Because I assumed it would be kind of like a choose your own adventure sort of a thing. Or should I decide? Should I play as if I was myself? Should I role play me and in Undertale? The latter ended up winning, and I was grateful for that, and I'll talk about that later. The next thing I want to talk about is the creation process involved here. This is probably the hardest thing to describe for me, because anybody who hasn't worked in programming probably has no idea what I'm talking about. See, the problem is there's actually two really big aspects to programming that people tend to differentiate. And I mean just the programming, not even the overall arcing design thing, but just when you get down to the code, there's two aspects. There's the actual typing up the code, and then there's designing the code, which I, to this day, don't remember the term for. It's something I actually went to school for, and it's probably the only thing with regards to programming I was ever actually good at. I was terrible at actually sitting down and coding stuff. But I could come up with the flowcharts. I used to actually purchase these really large poster papers from Walmart in order to design programs on them. This goes here, if then this, then the blah, blah, blah. You know, designing the logic of the code. And then I would hand that over to someone who was actually good at programming, who was not me, and say, hey, could you turn this into an actual program? And they were like, yeah, sure. And that's pretty much the only thing I was good at. I mention that because one of the reasons Undertale gets so much praise from me is the fact that it has brilliant code logic. I can't even imagine the flowcharts that Toby Fox had to have made for this game. It has to be absolutely labyrinthine. The number of flags that he keeps track of and the number of ways they come up is insane. For a while, and indeed I will probably keep doing this, as I go through this rumination, I'll be going through my notes, which I haven't even really touched yet, and I'll be mentioning a few things that it keeps track of, but making a full list of every single variable that comes out through this game would be monumental. It would probably take me an hour of just listing it. There's this, and there's this, and there's this. It is brilliantly designed. Let's talk about negatives really quick. First of all, one of the biggest negatives I hear about this game is the graphics. Now, obviously, the graphics don't bother me, but that being said, I would also not call these good graphics. Sprite graphics don't bother me, and they never have, actually. I've often considered sprite work to basically be just another genre of artistry, you know, kind of like expressionism or whatever. And so, good sprite work, you know, really good sprite work like Final Fantasy Tactics, for example, or Final Fantasy VI, or I'm sure I could think of other examples if I thought about it for a minute. There are other examples. The Mega Man X series, there we go. Really good sprite work is something I find to be beautiful, something I really enjoy. Undertale does not have bad sprite work, but I can't call it amazing sprite work like I can certain other games. The graphics are definitely one of the bigger down points of the game as a whole. There are a few moments where the graphics absolutely shine, and I'll be talking about more about that later. But overall, I've seen several people who have refused to even touch this game solely based on the graphics of it, and I can't blame them for that. Now, this next one I want to mention, I'm only mentioning this for the sake of completion. I love the music of this game, let me make that clear. I have listened to this, the soundtrack, I've bought the soundtrack and I've listened to it many, many, many times. I have not regretted that for a second. But I've heard several people who really don't like the music of this game, and several people say it's basically just the chiptunes nature of it, the 8-bitty nature, or the 16-bit nature in some cases, of the music and the way it's designed. And that's just not their thing. It's a coffee situation, and I can understand that and respect that. So, ironically, I feel that these are probably the two biggest obstacles to enjoying Undertale: the graphics and the music. I say that's ironic because for me those are usually the two least important aspects of a game, but I digress. I also have a friend of mine, good friend of mine, who has not played Undertale yet. His biggest reason why is because he's not that good at, I suddenly can't think of the genre, bullet hells. He's not that good at bullet hells. Now, granted, Undertale rarely enters actual bullet hell situation, but, you know, that's the general style of the gameplay. You moving around dodging the bullets of various types as they attack you, right? Now, I would sing praises of that. I think it's wonderful and amazing to see this kind of new style of combat brought into a gameplay. It's a great way to keep the RPG mechanics fresh. In several ways, I would say it's similar to what the Mario and Luigi series kept doing. AKA, rather than just being I select attack and then do this combination with the right timing or whatever in order to make the attack happen, or make the attack better for that matter. It's a nice way to take your standard turn-based RPG mechanic one step further by actually having there be an interactive mini-game effectively every time you attack, fairly minor, or every time they attack, fairly major. But I can see why that would be another obstacle. Finally, I have two other complaints. I personally have two complaints about this game. I'm actually not going to mention those right now. I will mention those as they come up. We're going to kind of go through the game pseudo-linearly. I'm going to do kind of a general thing first, and then we're going to switch over to some notes here about a couple of other things, and then we're going to switch back to the linear stuff. Now, before we... Well, actually, I'll cut that. I'll cut into that in a minute. So, The first thing I want to talk about is non sequitur. Non sequitur, I actually don't remember what it means literally off the top of my head, but it basically means doesn't fit. You know, something that is just, huh? It's a non sequitur can actually be very banal and it can be very out there. A penguin wearing a pair of pants is non sequitur. A giant spaghetti monster that's spewing moons made of chocolate that each one turns into a butterfly, that's also non sequitur. So there's a kind of a gradient, is what I'm trying to say. Now, I've always felt that non sequitur is a very precise tool to utilize, especially when it comes to storytelling, and even more especially when it comes to comedy. I'm not going to go into any specifics of other things, but there are certain channels and shows I could name that I feel took non sequitur too far. I feel that when you reach the point of total nonsense, like the second example I gave, it stops being funny. It stops being interesting. Instead, it's just noise at that point. If I could parallel this to music, a good non sequitur is a very complicated. I don't know musical terms at all. It's so sad. I compose my own music. I don't know musical terms. Its own section of music, right? A very complicated bleh of music is a good non sequitur. An overuse, a bad non sequitur, is when you're just mashing the keyboard for a few seconds and that's it. Undertale, in my opinion, hits the right balance there because there's plenty of non sequitur here, but every single aspect of it either is tempered by having enough logic, enough sense, enough reason to it, so that the non sequitur actually feels like it's out of place as opposed to being the norm. But also, in almost every case where there's something that's just kind of non sequitorial without the course of this game, it's something that fits within the lore of the setting that has been created. This pseudo-fantastical setting where wizards exist, remember, amongst the humans? And of course, monsters are literally made of magic. And therefore, their society and their existence doesn't really conform to our natural one, but it does conform to itself. Ergo, there is sense there. There is logic, there is reason. So most of the non sequitur things we see are grounded, and therefore the complicated bit of music rather than mashing the keyboard. Now, I already kind of talked about this. One thing that some people I've noticed don't really seem to realize is that everything in fiction is deliberate. There are, of course, actually some asterisks that have to be attached to this, like live action and movies are two really good examples. Anything with real people has the possibility of something that happens on camera that wasn't intended. But when you have something digital, whether it's drawn and animated or CGI, or if it's in a video game, everything you're seeing, with very few exceptions, is something that has to be deliberately put there. When the camera pans across a room, it's not like real life where you could just go into a room and pan the camera, and therefore if there's something in the background, it might be incidental. An animator, a CGI person, someone making a game, has to render every single aspect of that room that the camera's panning across. Make sense? So there's no accidents there. Okay, again, I keep saying there's no. There are very few accidents there. That picture is there because they drew that picture there. That vase is there because they drew that vase there. Make sense? Now, this is an informative tool when you're trying to analyze a work, because in a work where they do something like this, which is not live action, you can generally infer what they're trying to get across because of what's being shown on the screen. Now, I'm not going to go, again, in the same manner I'm not going over the flowchart thing. I'm not going to list every single thing throughout all of Undertale. It would be a huge list. But there is an enormous amount of specific, subtle, and overt symbolism that's put throughout the entirety of the work. And, very, very rarely will you look at something and say, well, that's just a wall because it's a wall. Well, that's just because this, because this. No, in basically every case, the design choice is very, very deliberate and gets across a point. Undertale is also very clearly a story that was constructed before it was written. Let me explain what that means a little bit. It's one of the more common types of writing. The idea is that you sit down and you write the world, the rules, the setting, the characters, and you basically establish the start point, the zero line, okay? And once you do that, you kind of have a general idea of where things are and where things are moving. And if the player didn't exist, you could probably keep writing the story as you have already established it, right? Then, once that's done, once all of that is established, then you write your story with the groundwork already established. Make sense? Again, this sounds like a duh. You'd be surprised how few people, well, I shouldn't say how few people, you'd be surprised how many works don't do this. And there are other lines of writing which are also, valid methods of doing so, which you can do other than the pre-establishment method. Like Overwatch is actually a good example of something that does the exact opposite of the pre-establishment method. But Undertale is very clearly this pre-establishment method, where it's like he wrote the whole thing, the whole setting, then he wrote the story. It also leads to a way of storytelling where you can weave exposition. You don't have to, and you don't always necessarily do so, but you can weave exposition in and out of the narrative, because as things are happening, you, the viewer, become informed about them. And you don't need to have a moment where Gandalf, or excuse me, not Gandalf, wow, I'm going to get some flack for this, where Dumbledore shows up. They're the same. Where Dumbledore shows up and says, here, let me explain the plot to you. You don't actually need to do that necessarily. You can just have things happen in the background, or have mentions of things, little tidbits that tie points together across your overall narrative so that it all seamlessly creates one overall narrative body. Next thing I want to talk about is the usage of standard stats in a way that was extremely bait and switch. Probably the single biggest theme of all of Undertale is bait and switch. I'll be talking about many, 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 many examples of it as we go through this rumination, but the HP and the EXP are, or love actually, XP and love are the two most common the two first examples of that throughout the course of this work. Execution points and level of violence, respectively. Both of these make sense because both of them effectively increase your HP, and both of them are described in character as being a way to distance yourself from the violent acts you undertake, ensuring that you become more and more accustomed to committing violent acts, ergo making it harder for you to be hurt in return. And given the metaphorical nature of the monsters and how there's actually an entry about it, I forget where, about how monsters specifically are more injured by someone with malevolent intent and malicious concept because of the fact that monsters are quite literally made of magic, and their souls don't work the same way as humans do. So even a kid with a knife can do tremendous damage to a massive hulking monster with a spear because of the fact of that malicious intent. And this HP XP thing is a good way of visually demonstrating that, and gameplay mechanics wise demonstrating that as you go throughout the game. It is also interesting because it's so unnecessary. There's no real need to increase your HP, your XP, or your love throughout the course of the game, as long as you bother to dodge everything. Now that is, of course, the hard part. I'll freely admit that. I'm not trying to say, good or anything like that. What I'm trying to say is that in most games, it's physically impossible to beat the game at level 1. There are precious few RPGs where a level 1 playthrough is possible. Chrono Trigger comes to mind as one of the very few. But in this one, it is possible. And that's kind of the variance there, and that's kind of the difference. And that leads me to my next point. One of the points I wanted to talk about is whether or not this game is actually meta. Now that sounds weird when you think about it. Let me start from a different perspective. The game feels structured as if it's intended to be played in 2 or 3 playthroughs. The first playthrough, you are pretty clearly and definitively supposed to get the neutral ending, and then decide based on that which ending you do next. It has been theorized by many other people, and I actually agree with this theory, that the intended path is neutral, genocide, true pacifist. Now, if you're paying attention, you know that ruins the true pacifist ending if you do it in that order. But that does make a degree of sense in its own way because of the nature of how things are structured. I'm not going to go too much into that. But I mention that because the neutral playthrough involves total ignorance, or at least it is intended to, and you don't really know the options that are available to you. You don't really know that you can spare everything. You don't really know that you can kill everything. You're just playing an RPG. But depending on how you play, the dialogue will lead you more towards playing that style of playthrough. And I'll talk more about this as we go through specifics as well. But the idea is, as you kill more, you get more to the idea that you can continue killing more. Or if you are trying to spare things generally, you'll and not kill most things, you will get more inclined to not kill. You're leaned in either direction depending on how your neutral playthrough is going through. And that's a great way to flesh out your options in the game, because the NPCs and the way they interact with you and their dialogue slowly informs you of the choices that are available to you, things that otherwise you wouldn't even be comprehensive or cognizant of. Truth be told, it took me relatively a while to really understand the fact that I could actually spare everything. I was mostly doing it at the beginning because I wanted to, because it was fun, and I was role-playing myself. Strange thought, but I'm actually not a killer. I know, weird. But as I was going through, it became more and more clear that that was something I could do. I got to my first boss, Papyrus, and I'm like, oh, God, maybe I have to actually defeat this guy. But then I managed it, and I'm like, well, I just beat my first boss without firing a shot. Maybe I can actually make this work. I got to Undyne, and I was really stuck on Undyne for a while. I'll talk about that more later. And I'm like, ugh. But then once again, it's like, yeah. And by that point, I was convinced I'm not killing anything. I'm not hurting a damn soul in this playthrough. This is going to be great. But I have heard from people who did the exact opposite. They were kind of going through, and they got to Papyrus, or they got to Undyne, and they got stuck. And they're like, so they beat them. They defeated them. And then they're like, and then people are like, oh my God, killing and blah, blah, blah. And it started leaning more towards the darker side, the killing side of things. And they became more aware of the fact that they could just keep killing everything in their path. Now, of course, going all the way for Genocide requires constant, diligent effort. But the funny thing is, going all the way for True Pacifist does too, which is why I say it's intended for 2 or 3 playthroughs. I find myself wondering if determination is unique to the Underground. It's definitely a part of the setting, but it's never really stated if it works above ground or not. I'll talk more about that in a bit. A few other little tidbits that occurred to me before we get into anything specific. I like the voices. It helps to distinguish dialogue. Different sound effects as the text is playing, and in many cases, I guess like several cases, there's different font. Papyrus has a different font. Sans has a different font. Some other guy has a different font. I'm not sure who that is. And I actually think there's another one. But either way, you get the point. Hang on, I'm checking my initial notes here. Several people have asked me Undertale's position in the Imperium. I've decided not to talk about that in this rumination, because I imagine plenty of you here have no idea what the Imperium is, and don't care, and don't want to listen to me ramble about one of my fictional works, and how it relates to Undertale, when a rumination about that. So I've decided not to bore you with that, instead move on to something else. Now I want to do a name drop here. I got his name, I got his website up right now, Jason M.U. I asked his permission to plug him and to credit him for several of the work that I'm going to be talking about here in just a moment. He has a website, jasonyu.me, or you can just look up jasonm.u. That's YU. He has a musical narrative webpage. It's some cool stuff. He did a musical analysis, basically, on Undertale, and I'm going to be referencing several of his works in the next few minutes here. And I wanted to give him that big plug there. So, there are 3 motifs. I'm saying this wrong. There are 3 types of leitmotifs that go throughout the course of this work. There's dialogue, visual, and musical. Now, the dialogue is obvious. I kind of just talked about that, the different fonts for some of the characters. But what's different, in addition to that, is the usage of format of text is different, too. This is probably most notable in the True Lab, but the way they talk, the way they structure their sentences, the tone of the text. In most cases, you can tell who's speaking, even if you didn't hear anything. Even if there was no, this person is speaking line, if you just had the text in front of you and you knew about the characters, you could probably tell who's speaking. So each character has a distinct voice that they speak in. In addition to this, their punctuation, capitalization is different. In some cases, of course, the font is different, and of course, there's the tone. There's literally an audio tone that's constantly playing that distinguishes who's talking. This is it's funny to me because it took me a while to realize that it was actually Asgore who was talking to me most of the time during the game over screen. Obviously, it took me until I reached Asgore and was like, aha! And then I guessed wrong because I was an idiot. But whatever. Asgore. You could tell that because of the fact that that's his voice speaking when you do that. Furthermore, there's also this delta rune thing that you see constantly throughout the work. In terms of... So we kind of moved on from dialogue. Let's move on to visual. The delta rune, first of all, is an anagram for Undertale, for those of you not aware. It's a constant visual repetition. You see it basically from the beginning of the game to the end of it. And it constantly is a way to help remind you not only of your fate, Like the whole game feels like this big build up to the fact that you have to kill Asgore, or you have to accept being killed by Asgore, and that's it, and that's the only thing. But also you learn about this prophecy. Now the funny thing is the prophecy actually has two interpretations. One is true pacifist and one is genocide. Rather appropriate there. But the true pacifist one is interesting most to me because it's not actually you who fulfills that, it's Asriel. The one who came from the surface and opens the gate and all that fun stuff, blah, blah, blah. There's other visual representations, of course. Probably the most obvious one is color. The usage of color is all over the place. I actually have a bit of a list here. It's kind of truncated, so forgive me for just kind of going down the list here. But there are 8 colors represented in this game, and each of them have some repeated significance throughout the entire work. The blue, so like some of these colors are specifically assigned to characters. Like blue, for example, is assigned to Papyrus, and technically to Sans, but also to Papyrus. That's the music, or excuse me, that's the music. That's the color of integrity, which I think is actually rather appropriate for Papyrus. But also, see, there's another little interesting thing here. As you go throughout the work, as you go throughout the game, you slowly get better gear over time, right? You get the notebook, you get the ballet shoes, etc. As we see in the Flowey X / Omega Flowey / Photoshop Flowey battle, each of those colors of those souls of humans is associated with one of those things that we got equipment-wise throughout the course of the game. Now that's cool, and another way that the colors thing kind of presents this visual motif throughout the course of the work, but the really more horrifying thought there is the fact that that means each time you get to a place and find that equipment, that's how far that previous human got. And that's also probably the most definitive way in my mind that highlights the fact that that's as far as they got. That Asgore did not personally kill, all these different children, that just the monsters of the underground did. Yeah, which is kind of worse when you think about it. But anyways, blue. Blue is associated with music and with the dancing thing. Green is associated to Undyne, of course, and is the color of kindness, which again I think is actually very fitting for her. And cooking. Muffet, the Spider-Woman, is associated with purple, which is the color of perseverance and associated with studying and learning. Mettaton, and I keep wanting to say Metatron, so forgive me if I slip up on that, is associated with yellow, which is the color associated with justice. You can kind of see how these start to make sense here. And of course, was shooting guns, etc. Light blue was associated with patience, and orange was associated with bravery. Now, if you're thinking about this for a moment, another way this comes in is each of these colors also has to do... Oh, and by the way, red is associated with determination. Each of these colors also has something to do with the game modes that happen. For example, in Papyrus, your integrity is when you're actually affected by gravity and you have to jump over things. Undyne is when you have to defend. Muffet is when you have to go up and down the lines. Mettaton is when you have to shoot. Light blue, patience, is when you have to not move. Orange, bravery, is when you do have to move. You kind of see how this lines up here. It's a nice little thing, and it's one of the excellent things about Undertale in general. And of course, these colors come through everywhere. Occasionally someone will say a bit of text that has one of the colors in it that is supposed to indicate something like that. And some of the cases that you'll see them in combat. Again, the Photoshop flower being the biggest example. Let's talk about the music briefly. I actually have 2 pages of notes on the music. I'm going to be running through this. Again, Mr. Jason MU has a much better and much more in-depth analysis on the music. As I said before, I may compose my own music, but that's all digital. I actually failed my music theory class. I don't know musical terminology, and I don't know music theory all that well. It is not something I'm good at. So I'm going to be just describing this kind of from a layman's perspective. If you actually want a more in-depth musical analysis from someone who actually knows music and can study as a musician, hit his website up and see that there. So, there are several leitmotifs when it comes to the musical tones throughout the game. In fact, some people have argued that there's only one song in Undertale. Those people are wrong. There are actually several distinct, different leitmotifs that are present. However, Toby Fox does very clearly and distinctly use those leitmotifs constantly. You can see how the exact same note groups, the motifs, are actually used throughout several different songs. However, each time it's done so with deliberate intent. For example, there's the leitmotif of home, which plays right at the beginning, and then the ruins motif. Now, the ruins motif is probably one of the most interesting ones to me, because with one cluster of exceptions, which I'll get to later, every song leading up to and including the Undyne fight has that tone or that rhythm, or both, of the ruins theme, the ruins leitmotif going throughout the song. There's this is probably best demonstrated with the waterfall song, because the waterfall song has a slightly different presentation to it, but it's still the same overall leitmotif, just a different iteration of it. And then when we get to further songs, including the Undyne fight, which I guess I'll talk about in just a second here, the ruins leitmotif and the waterfall leitmotif are both actually present in Undyne's theme, which I suppose I'll talk about now. So Undyne actually has 3 themes total, not counting anything else. There's your basic yeah, and then there's the fight, the second fight, and then there's Battle Against a True Hero. Now, each of these is actually kind of brilliant in its own way, but the real one I want to talk about right now is Battle Against a True Hero, because in that song, it contains all the leitmotifs previously, the home, the ruins, the waterfall, all that, and her own previous theme, and yet it's all presented in a way that it slowly increases in complexity as it is presented. So rather than just being your standard leitmotif, there's a standard leitmotif with other notes added in, with other melodies underneath, or I guess that would actually be harmonies underneath, with other, I don't know the words, I told you, I'm not a musician, with other, it's complexity, they add more complexity to it. I mean, I've seen the musics, I've seen the notes. Excuse me. And of course, Battle Against a True Hero itself is the culmination of that, because it shows all of that taken to its furthest extent. Which is very appropriate, because that is Undyne herself taken to her furthest extent. The most she can do, the hardest she can try, the furthest she can push herself. Then we rewind a bit. Hotland and Core also have the same leitmotif going through them, and several of the other songs throughout there, of course. And so that kind of forms the second half of groups of songs, which all share the same leitmotif. I keep saying that word. It gets more weird every time I say it. The same motifs. I'm just going to say that. And is that better? That's what my notes say, because I don't want to write leitmotif 100,000 times on my notes. But the funny thing is, those leitmotifs both come through in the same way that Undyne's did. Where the ruins and the waterfall and all that came into Undyne, Hotlands and Core and all that come into Mettaton and his fight theme. And of course, his fight theme gets just a little bit more fabulous each time it's presented. It's fairly obvious stuff there. I don't want to talk about that. Now, I want to rewind a bit before we go further, because the next one I want to talk about is Snowdin. Snowdin's a weird one to talk about. Actually, you know what? I've changed my mind. I hope I'll remember. I'm going to keep a finger here. This usually helps me to remember. I'll do this, actually. I need to remember to talk about Snowdin later. Snowdin doesn't fit, though. Snowdin and the snowy area and all the songs that play within the Snowdin area all have their own leitmotif that is completely self-contained, and there's a very good narrative reason for that, and I'll talk about it later. So let's move on, then, to Alphys' theme. Now, Alphys, or Alphys, I've always called her Alphys. I'm sure you guys are going to disagree with me on pronunciations. Lord knows my pronunciations are terrible. But her theme is actually brilliantly subtle, because da 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 da, and then the very next thing is da 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 da, because the whole point is the music is trying to outdo itself in its own tonality, in the way it functions, and that is the main motif right there, is those 6 notes. Or I guess that's actually 10 notes, excuse me. I can count, I swear. But that is so her, isn't it? While she is certainly defined as shy and introvert, and I'll talk more about her later, what really defines her is the fact that she's constantly trying to outdo herself. Like, well, I can do this. No, I can do it even better! And there's sort of an awkward earnestness about that kind of helps define her and is present in their music. And then, of course, you take that music, add a second layer underneath it to make it into a chord, a minor chord, if I'm not mistaken, and then all of a sudden you have the true lab theme. Done in a different tone, but still, it's the same notes, it's the same motif. It is basically Alphys' theme, just done in a horrifying way. This is a wonderful way to explain and showcase how you can take something that's da, 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 and turn it into something nightmarish horrible, even though you basically have the same notes. But of course the True Lab would have earth tone to it. I mean, why wouldn't it? The next thing I want to talk about is Flowey's theme. Now, Flowey's theme is actually really interesting to me. And I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but he actually has two themes. We're going to just go ahead and call these the good theme and the evil theme. The good theme's obvious. You hear that the very first time you ever encounter him. And the evil theme is also obvious. You hear that when he starts to go "Wah!" on you and turns into some incredibly horrifying creature. I got to be honest, by the way, first time I ever saw Flowey, my reaction was just to kind of push away from the screen. I just didn't want to have anything to do with that. Holy hell. He is damn terrifying. That's some good sprite work on Flowey right there. Anywho, but the funny thing about Flowey's tones is most of his notes overall follow the same general pattern, and this is best shown in Your Best Nightmare. Because during the Your Best Nightmare fight, and I know I'm kind of skipping forward, but I want to talk about music just here. During the Your Best Nightmare fight, when you start off the fight, it's actually the evil leitmotif that's playing. And then it cuts to the first soul, and the good leitmotif is playing underneath that tune. And then it cuts back to evil, and it goes back and forth. Every time you're doing one of the soul sections, it's the good Flowey theme. Every time you're fighting, Photoshop Flowey, it's the evil motif. Make sense? The way that's actually brilliant is each time it goes back to evil, the music gets a little bit more frenetic. More notes are added, and the time is slowly increased until it's literally, by the end, running at double time, double speed, just to show how desperate and oh God, frenzied that Flowey has become over the course of the fight as he feels that he's losing control. So now to move my second page of music notes here. There's some very, very obvious parallels between Toriel and Asgore's theme, but one of the things that I find really fascinating about Asgore's theme is that wait, what does that say? Oh yeah, is that Undyne's theme shows up briefly during Asgore's fight, which makes sense. But the other one is the game over music, the tune, the motif, if you will, from the game over screen, which is the one where Asgore's voice speaks, also shows up during the Asgore fight. Which also makes a lot of sense when you really think about it, doesn't it? The most powerful, in my opinion, and I agree, Jason pushed me onto this, and then I did some listening of my own, and I was like, he's absolutely correct. Like I said, I'm not a musician person. I'm just a nerd with an opinion. The most powerful leitmotif combination in this, in my opinion, is the combination of the main theme and the compassion theme. There's a theme that plays in the intro, and it's kind of present in the ruins motif, right? But then when you go to the umbrella, remember the umbrella puzzle? You get the umbrella and you put it on the statue, and a song plays, and then you can go and play it on the piano. Remember that? It's actually one of Undyne's only puzzles she actually contributed. I'll talk more about puzzles later. And that motif is interesting. It's kind of soft, it's kind of sad, but it's most interesting because if you put it right after the main Undertale theme, it becomes suddenly amazingly clear that this is one tune, one motif between these two. It's just been split in two. But when you combine the main theme of Undertale with the theme of Compassion, you get one overall complete tune, which is then present in several key moments in later songs, right towards the end. Most notably, when you start to earn your main ending and things start to come together, the ending theme, etc. Excuse me. And so then everything just comes together for all the last few songs. Every one of the few songs that plays during the finale of the True Pacifist Route, of course, is a tune that is significant in some way because of its connections to previous motifs. The neutral ending song is actually the Ruins tune, which is a take on it. The final boss includes the main motif, both Flowey motifs, and the standard enemy motif. Then it has evil Flowey, and then it has good Flowey, and then it has the compassion tone, and it ends on the compassion motif in the final boss fight. And the one where you're fighting Asriel Dreamer. And then, of course, you have a song called Bring It In, Guys, which is basically the, no really, ending song, which has every single motif that has been present up to the game to date. All of them are present. Every single song has some presence in the ending song, which is, of course, a wonderful musical metaphor to combine everything in the end like that. I love it. I love it. So that's the end of that page of notes. I have a couple pages of notes. What do you want from me? So, whoops, hang on. We're a little bit ahead of ourselves here. That's the ending. I have a couple pages of notes. I want to talk about the Genocide route first. Now we're going to kind of go through the game. But I want to talk about the Genocide route. Obviously, I've never played it. I have actually only seen bits and pieces of it. Most notably, of course, the Undyne fight, and the Asgore fight, and the, if you could call it a fight, and the Sans fight. Oh, that reminds me, since we were talking about music, some people have asked me, what about Megalovania? Well, it has no leitmotifs from the entire rest of the game. That is more like a leitmotif from Toby Fox himself, given how many times he's used that in the past, which admittedly isn't that often, but it is kind of his theme song. And it's a damn good song. I've heard some good takes on it. So, Genocide. The Genocide section also shows that forethought in construction that I mentioned before, about how, having gone through and established the setting, he can live bits and pieces. There's actually information you get about the lore and about the characters that you only get on the Genocide side. There's certain things that you only learn as a result of that. I'm not going to go down the list, of course, but it does show how this was a completely constructed work before he started writing it. It is wonderfully horrifying, the Genocide route. And that's probably no surprise to anybody who's actually played the Earthbound Halloween hack. I actually had poked at the Earthbound Halloween hack. I was a big Earthbound fan, and a big fan of Mother.net, or not, Starmen.net, excuse me, in general. So, that was something that ran across my thing. I never actually finished it, to be completely blunt. I ended up watching the rest of it on YouTube after Undertale came out, because I was reminded of it. So let's talk about the meta thing, okay? I have been asked my opinion on the meta of this game many times, and over a while, I have kind of had a morphic opinion. So here it is. Here's my opinion. You ready for this, guys? I don't think this is a one-layer meta game. In other words, I don't think this is a game in which you're playing a game. You're playing an RPG, and Chara is the representation of, gamers, right? I don't think that. I think this is a two-layer meta in which you get to decide if it's meta or if it isn't, and that's built into the game. Because if you really sit back and really deconstruct this game, the Genocide route is very meta, and the true pacifist route is not. There are extremely few moments, all of which have to do with Flowey, actually, in the true pacifist route that could be considered meta. And in all of those cases, it isn't actually meta. It can just be interpreted as meta. Whereas on the Genocide route, it's pretty much flat out stated that it is a meta thing. Although it is worth noting it is still up to interpretation. But it's much heavier on the side of this is a meta commentary sort of a thing. So I mention this because several people have asked me, what do I interpret Undertale as? Some people think it's a meta commentary on modern RPGs. Some people think it's a deconstruction RPGs, blah, blah, blah. I think it is a story, not a tale, ironically, on the one side, and then a meta commentary on RPGs on the other side. But not, actually, I'm using the wrong term. I don't want to say commentary. Because the basic question that's being asked here is the oldest question we've ever asked. It's one of the oldest jokes when it comes to RPGs. No, I'm serious. All the way back, I've heard this joke since Final Fantasy IV first came out. This is not new. And the joke is, well, what would it be like if someone just broke into your house and started stealing your stuff and wandered out? Like you do in an RPG, right? What would happen if you just went out and killed a bunch of people because they happen to be enemies? People have been doing that joke and variations on that joke, what it would be like if you were actually in the game, for decades. Like I said, it's one of the oldest video game jokes I'm even aware of. People are still doing that joke to this day. And so it's like that. What would it be like if there was a fully fleshed out world that someone was playing as if it was an RPG? Now I'm going to take a weird parallel here. Any of you out there ever played Grand Theft Auto? Bonus question. Any of you out there ever seen the Heath Ledger Joker Batman movie? I can't remember what it's called. It's like Dark Knight something. But anyways, the second of the Nolan Batman movies, in other words. The one with Heath Ledger's the Joker. Now, what's the thread that ties all this together? I've done a deconstruction of Heath Ledger's the Joker, but I feel the one most important aspect of his character is that he's playing a video game. Hear me out. He doesn't care about consequences. You may care about the consequences of a video game. I mean, there's plenty of ways that you could say this. If you're doing a hardcore run in Diablo 2, for example, you care about dying. But you don't really, do you? You don't die. You just have to start over. Even when you have an investment, even when you have some semblance of caring about what happens in a video game, it's not the same as if it was real, is it? It's still a game. I've actually talked about this many times. I've talked about this with regards to Mass Effect and how many of us were affected by the Mass Effect 3 situation. It was still just a game, but we were still affected by it, right? But imagine if you were actually there. That's what Heath Ledger's Joker was doing. He was playing a game. He didn't care about the consequences. If he died, oh well. He was willing to do anything because none of it really mattered to him. The consequences had no effect on him. I say this in relation to Grand Theft Auto because that's how most people play Grand Theft Auto. If you decide to go on a rampage or you get pissed off at someone and just start killing, one of the most common things I see players do, and I've done it, my friend Gary's done it, and a lot of other people I've seen play GTAs do it, you get to the point where it's actually simpler and easier to not evade the cops and to just keep killing cops and killing civilians until you die. Because that's the easy reset button. You don't care about the fact that you died because you're just going to go to the hospital, aren't you? Because it's a game. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying you don't care about it. What I am saying is it's a game. That's where Undertale comes into it. Chara is playing Undertale as if it's a game. But the game goes out of its way to show you that these are people, that from their perspective, they're living their lives, they're everything. This is why the non sequitur thing I mentioned earlier is so important, because there has to be that cohesiveness to make it feel like this is a world that's actually happening. So even in the genocide route, all of these characters are behaving as if they could actually... It's the if you could see it happen thing. It's the biggest difference between a story and a tale. A tale you can never see actually happening. It's just too nonsensical. It doesn't fit. But a story does. A story adheres to its own rules. And so because Undertale is so self-coherent, you could see this actually happening. But Chara doesn't care about these things as if they're actual people, as if they're actual lives, as if they're actual places. Chara is treating it as if it's a game. Make sense? So Chara doesn't give a damn about the consequences. And neither does the player going through the genocide route. You see how this ties in here? This reminds me of an episode of Star Trek Voyager, just to really beat the point in. It's called Worst Case Scenario. And I actually talked about that. I have a rumination up about it if you want to go watch it, because I'm going to discuss it much more in deep depth there than I do here. The general thought is there's several people who hop on the holodeck to play through a scenario, the worst case scenario. It's a theoretical, oh my god, what if the Maquis rebelled kind of a thing. And some of the people who were playing that scenario played it as if they were, to put it in such terms, role players. They were playing it as if they were a character in the story, right? You will know what it's like. I'm sure several of the people watching this video right now play games in exactly that same manner. And I do it too sometimes. I vary. But you play it as if you're actually there present, right? You role play. One of the people in that show, Tom Paris, was playing it as if it was a frickin' game. He actually was talking rather openly and brazenly about how he just wanted to go have fun. Now, let me make this clear, because I made this point back in that rumination. I want to make that point here, too. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with either perspective. If you want to play a game as if you are a character in that game, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you don't go too far with it. And if you want to play the game as if it's a frickin' game, there's nothing wrong with that. But the genocide route very clearly shows the second perspective, whereas the true pacifist route very clearly shows the former. And that brings me to my final commentary, and something that Javan was really pissed off about when we went through this. I don't even know if Javan's watching this. I haven't seen him on my stream in forever. This is a game in which it's shown that you can play as a role player or as a gamer, very distinctly and separately from each other in the way it's presented. Now, obviously, that is itself a fallacy. Not all people who focus on the game don't care about the stories they're playing through. I'll give you a direct example. My best friend Gary is someone who is like, I just want to go through and get the things over with. I'm not going to be kind or nice to people or whatever. But he still very much is invested in the story. He wants to know what happens next, and he wants to be a part of it. And there's nothing wrong with a role player being a gamer. I'll use myself as an example of that. I tend to get right in there. I'm the guy who doesn't use stim packs in StarCraft 2. Why? Because I know what those do to Marines. They're horrible. And so I refuse to use them because of the role player in me. But that doesn't mean I don't enjoy good gameplay. That doesn't mean I don't love when the game is engaging and the mechanics are fun. So these aren't as distinguished as one might think. They're not completely segregate from each other. But they are two different camps of thought, and there's no denying that Genocide is aimed more towards the gamers. And the most adamant expression of that is Sans and the Megalovania fight. That is a brilliant, well-designed, well-crafted, fun, amazing, absolutely fantastic fight. It is a brilliant, brilliant fight and incredibly well-crafted. And itself is a deconstruction. How many games out there let you play the final boss? Think about it for a moment. Sans isn't the final boss of the Genocide route. You are. And Sans is the one fighting you. Think about the way that fight works. Think about how it is constructed. Think about the way it ends. Everything about that fight, well, not everything, most everything about that fight is non-standard for a reason. And this goes back to the FF4 effect, which I'll reference as well later. So just remind me. Remind me, guys. In the past. Go back in time and remind me when you're watching this, later this month. But I love it. I love the overall presentation of the gameplay. It's a shame I will never get to do that fight. But that's something I can accept. Now, the final thing I want to mention with regards to the Genocide route is Chara. Now, we actually learn more about Chara in the Genocide route than we do in the True Pacifist route. We learn tidbits about her, but we learn most of the information about her. Oh, I'm sorry, real quick. I'm going to be referring to Frisk and Chara both as female because it never even occurred to me that they were supposed to be gender neutral until someone pointed that out to me. So I automatically assumed they were both girls. Moving on. We learn quite a bit about her, and it's pretty much implied that she is a horrible human being. Now, of course, we know that the human world is fantastical, just like the monster world is, but it's not as fantastical. It is not until she reaches the monster world that she realizes that she can have the fantastical for herself. She was just a kid up there. And whether she was abused or tortured or whether she was just a horrible, hideous human being, we don't know. It could be both. But either way, there was something just wrong with Chara, in lore, as it's presented in the story. And she tried to use basically a trick to take over the game, basically, to make the game go the way she wanted it to, and to kill everyone, la 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 la, and just to wipe out everything, because she hated everything, and she wanted it all to hurt and suffer. This is someone who was laughing at poisoning their adopted father. There's something diseased in that mind. And then, of course, when they went to the surface, when she went to the surface in Asriel, it was Asriel who refused to go ahead and use their incredible power to wipe out the humans. She wanted to kill them all. That's what she always wanted, was to kill them all. It's okay, though. She failed at taking over the game through Asriel. She had the determination to make that work, and that determination then ended up, through a lot of means of Alphys and experimenting, into Flowey, into Asriel. But it's okay, because later on she'll get a real method in order to go ahead and make her plans come to pass. Because it's very clearly stated that you, the player character, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong, that Frisk is the one that wakes her up. And that through the actions of the player character, Frisk is allowed to become more and more like Chara, until it gets to the end where it's basically pretty clear that that is Chara, and in every way that matters by the time you're at the end of the game. Most notably, several of the things you interact with, the coffin, all the stuff in Asgore's home, and the descriptions of a few items are said in red text, red being Chara's text tone, using the earlier visual motif thing, and also are much more horrifying. Like, the coffin is just as comfortable as it looks. I mean, what the hell? And then I cannot help but comment on how absolutely horrifying the ending ends up being. Ignoring the thing where she comes at the screen to stab the screen in Alt F4 the game. Ignoring the thing where she takes over for the true pacifist route and ends up winning thanks to your actions and going and wiping out the human world. Let's ignore all that. Flowey. It's so weird that in both routes, Flowey ends up being portrayed as sympathetic. as he is slowly going more and more terrified of you till it gets to the point where he desperately runs to Asgore and then kills Asgore in a fit of, oh God, please don't kill me, and then begs for you not to kill him, and then you beat him to death until there's nothing left but pulp. That's Chara right there. Let's move on to the pacifist ending, shall we? So my sister had an interesting commentary here. She's never played Undertale, but she had sympathy for Flowey as well, because in her perspective, based on what I told her, Flowey's life was ruined by your entering it. Because the person who has the most determination in the underground, this is why I mentioned I'm curious if determination is just in the underground, has the ability to save and load. Access to the load states and the save states. And this is presented as an in-lore thing. Again, I don't think this is actually a meta-commentary, any more than if you had those kind of superpowers in real life to just rewind time to a certain point, then that would be, oh, I'm playing a game. It's presented as if that's something that's happening in lore. So Flowey's life is ruined by her entrance, and the thing I find interesting is he sees something new, yet it probably doesn't even occur to him he's seeing something new at first. He's just seeing something else, and it's like, oh, hi, I'm going to kill you, because that's how this works. Some people have argued that Flowey immediately tries to kill Frisk because Flowey recognizes either A, Frisk is a threat, or B, Frisk is the reason why he lost his determination. Not sure which. And then Toriel says something to Flowey, word for word, and knocks Flowey away. I want you to remember that in the back of your mind. Just keep it back there somewhere. Now, I admit, when I was playing through this, I was super suspicious of Toriel. I was like, oh my God, she's some horribly, hideously evil person, and she's going to stab me and kill me. Admittedly, part of that is because I was put into that suspicious mood by Flowey. This is one of the interesting bait and switches in the game. Because the game it pulls a double bait and switch. Flowey's like, hi, I'm happy and lovely. And then he turns into evil, horribleness. Ha 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 ha. And yet, so you're put in the mindset of, oh God, everything's horrible, and yet that's actually not true. In fact, with extremely few exceptions, and I mean extremely few, I would argue none, personally, none of the other monsters of the underground are horrible or evil or anything. There's a few that are certainly a little more violent than should be accepted. And again, as I mentioned, those kids had to die somehow. But none of them are just outright malicious or evil. Are they? Flowey is the exception there, and that's even funnier because Flowey is not a monster. Nor is he a human. Anywho. So then we get to the ruins. I found myself wondering if the ruins were what's left of what the monster empire had been. I shouldn't say empire, but the monster kingdom, back when it was above ground. And everyone, of course, abandoned the ruins. They talk about that, actually, as they go and settle the other areas. And I find myself wondering, is this how big and how amazing they used to be? We do know that there's lots and lots of monsters living in the capital. We just don't see any of them for the sake of narrative purpose, other than the ones that show up to tell the tale. Haha. The prophecy of what happened with Chara, what happened with Asriel, and how they think you are now going to save them, or rather, Asgore's going to save them by helping them go to the future, and finally, the first surface, and finally being free. Also, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that Toriel's name is very clearly a take on tutorial, and that's very clearly what she does at the beginning of the game. Knowing now that most of the ruins section is part of the demo makes a lot more sense, because it's very clear that this was designed to be a, here's how this game works, kind of a thing, and I don't mind it. It's actually one of the better tutorials I've seen in a game recently. Some of it's skippable and some of it isn't. But I do like its presentation overall, especially since it's presented in lore, and as is actually mentioned later, puzzles are kind of a cultural thing for the monsters, which again kind of is sort of that, puzzles and boss monsters are both cultural things for the monsters. Think about it for a moment. It is worth noting that Toriel is a fascinating character. I don't have much other notes about her, but she is very kind-hearted and gentle, and yet she is not weak. I am reminded, I know this is going to sound like a weird thing, of Dr. McCoy over on Star Trek, who is very kind-hearted and very gentle and very nice and very strong at the same time. It's an unusual combination when you think about it. You don't actually see that kind of a thing very often. And Toriel is definitely that. This is someone who has no problem walking up to the king of all monsters and saying, no, you're an idiot. And she says that rather blatantly later on. It is probably ironic to me that based on how you're playing, Frisk is either her greatest joy or her worst nightmare, or arguably both. Because this is a woman who has lost most everything. She is very alone. She does not have, her family or her friends. All she really has is this little area that's locked off by itself. And a kid shows up. And the kid, if you're playing true pacifist, is nice and kind and polite. Yes, I know you don't have to be nice and kind and polite, but I'm going to assume you are if you're doing true pacifist. I'm assuming you're not being a dick as you're going through it. And can treat her as if, she's their mother, right? Or can frickin' murder her. Or can be nice to her, then murder her. So again, that kind of, oh, this is a wonderful thing versus, oh, this is a horrible thing. But of course, it could also be both, because this could be this wonderful, amazing thing, and then she just kind of has to let you go, knowing that you will die or that you'll kill her husband, one of the two. Obviously, he's not her husband anymore. We see a lot of little details in that section. There's something called unasked kindness. It's one of the things that I love most in real life, and something I try to do for my friends and family as often as I'm able. In other words, when you give someone something without being asked it, And in this case, it's shown with the pie slice that shows up. You go take a nap and you wake up, and there's a slice of butterscotch pie just kind of hanging out there on the floor. There's something touching about that. I don't know how to explain. Maybe that's just a thing with me. But when someone goes out of the way to help you or give to you or take care of you or to show you that they care without being prompted, it means more, I mean, it's nice and great to get some candies on Valentine's Day, but if it's May 13th, which has nothing to do with anything, and suddenly you get some candies because, hey, you're awesome and I love you, that has more meaning, at least to me. And so I thought that was a really nice... I don't want to add romantic connotations. That's unnecessary. Point being, it was a very touching gesture, and it kind of made my heart melt just a little bit when I saw that. I love her song. I know I've already kind of talked about the music stuff and, the motifs and thereof, but her song is just really, really nice. The fight is also one of the interesting game and story integrations, because you cannot mercy her in the normal way, the way you've been able to do with every monster up until that point. But if you're low enough in health, she won't attack you. Her attacks will actually avoid you, because she doesn't want to kill you. That's not her goal. She's trying to make you turn away. She's trying to make you flee. And yet, and then of course you can kill her, or you can die, or you can spare her. There's several different ways you can go about this. But it's a great way to integrate story and gameplay. And it also, again, shows that Toriel is no slouch when it comes to combat. So then we pop out. Then there's the camera. This is really nice to me. I didn't catch this my first time around. There's a camera right there at the ruins entrance. That's how long Alphys has been watching us throughout the course of Undertale. She knew from the very beginning, from when we exited that place, that we were there. It just blows my mind a little bit. Again, it's that whole constructed theory. It's very well crafted. There's some great build-up into Sans. This is yet another example of the bait and switch, because it's so suspenseful for no reason, and yet for a reason. The no reason is because Sans obviously does not wish you any ill. He's just here to give you a whoopee cushion in the handshake. Ha ha ha! And of course, the whole lead up to that is just, oh god, oh god, oh god, there's something behind me, and oh my crap. The reason there is a reason for it to be suspenseful is because it's Sans, a.k.a. someone who is, well, he's not powerful. Do I talk about that later? I'd talk about that over here. He's not actually powerful, but he's probably the deadliest character in the entire game that isn't the main character. So there is plenty of reason to be afraid of him. And it has been debated many, many times, and I actually agree with this thought, that Sans would have just flat out killed you right there, if not for the fact that Toriel asked him not to, made him promise, actually, to take care of you. That Sans would have actually just straight up murdered you right there if it wasn't for that thing. I could see that. And he kind of says that right out later on when you have that dinner with him. And then he tries to joke it off. So, like I said, it's the bait and switch theme. It's all over the place. Note Son's laziness. So there's just a couple things here. First of all, he's super lazy, and then he says, "You go ahead," and he goes backwards, and he doesn't seem to have any motive to do anything. There's a lot of little foreshadowing to Sans' character in that very first scene when you first meet him. It's actually interesting how much that is visible in hindsight. That was character development is present there. Then we encounter Doggo, the poor T-Rex. He serves as a nice tutorial for blue attacks, but he himself is also a bait and switch, like so many other things. I'm not going to talk about every character you interact with, just this one occurred to me. Because in lore and in gameplay, he looks like, you know, he looks like he's this horrible person, but then when you give him a pet, he's like, oh, this is wonderful and amazing. I love being pet. Oh, yes, good. But furthermore, the blue thing itself is actually a bait and switch, because, well, I'll talk more about that later. I've got two things to remember now. The snowman that you encounter earlier, again, I'm not going to go over every NPC throughout the whole game, but the snowman you encounter right early on is a great example of the multiple choice pathways, the every route leads to Rome style of gameplay and style of storytelling that this game uses, because you can go to it and you can take the snow piece all the way to the end and he'll be super happy, and the game will even mention it. Or you can take the snow piece and lose it and he'll be like, no, but he'll give you a second one. Or you can take it and eat right in front of him because you're a horrible person and he'll be like, oh my god. Or you can just keep taking from him until you kill him. Let's talk about Snowdin. Finally, I can talk about Snowdin. Now, where's my music notes? Shoot. I have so many notes for this game. Here we go. Snowdin is perfect in almost every way. It's probably one of the most well-constructed narrative things I've ever seen. I mean this sincerely. Snowdin is brilliant. It's right up there with I can't think of the name of it all of a sudden. The Doma train situation over in Final Fantasy VI. So Snowdin's musical motifs, I told you I'd bring this up later, are all self-contained. There's one leitmotif for Snowdin, and it plays in the snowy area, it plays in the town, it plays in the shop, it plays during the dating sequence. It's all the same motif. Why? Because of Snowdin's narrative point. At this point in the game, logically speaking, there are three possibilities. Either you walked in, didn't know what's going on, and have killed a few things, and then you see this light, happy town of silly people and a light tune and overall, major key kind of a stuff. There's a Christmas tree, there's kids playing, and you're like, these are people. That's supposed to be the these are people moment. Like, oh my god, what have I done kind of a moment. This is especially true if you killed Toriel. I know 2 players personally who killed Toriel without malicious intent. They thought it was the only way to proceed through the game. They couldn't figure out how to spare her. So they killed her, and they felt terrible about it. And then they get to Snowdin, and they're like, One of them restarted the game at that very moment and vowed to spare Toriel, and then messaged me and was like, how do I spare Toriel? I'm like, okay, here, let me tell you. Snowdin is designed to do that. Visually, audially, in terms of what's there, in terms of the narrative structure, in terms of its point in the overall narrative. This is the moment at which it's hardest to do genocide. And yet, if you're doing the genocide route, this is the second option of what's going to happen, there's no one there. They evacuated. The town of light, happy people fled in the face of you. Or, if you've spared everyone, third option now. You go in, all the enemies you spared are there in Snowdin. They're not enemies anymore. They're just NPCs. They're people, not monsters. You get it? And they're all just going about their lives, doing their jobs, being happy. And everything about Snowdin screams this. Up to and including the boss of the area. Now, the puzzle sections leading up to Snowdin is amazingness. I especially love the tile puzzle. Keep that in mind for later, too, by the way. And you go through there, and it's like everything we see here is the understanding that these monsters don't want to hurt you. They don't want to kill you. I can actually picture that all the previous humans who died, whether they were murdered or not, I know this is not exactly a big defense, but it was not done like with malicious intent. It was done with regretful determination, for lack of a better term, like with Asgore at the end of this game. And so And this is a theme that will go through the whole game. No one you fight has malicious intent towards you, with the one exception. And even that one exception is just a broken, bitter soul. No one wants to hurt you. None of the monsters are monsters, like Chara was. And this also is the beginning of when we start to see their plight. These people are stuck underground. And on the one hand, they've made a life for themselves. But on the other hand, it's clear that they're still unhappy with it. They smile so they don't have to cry, I believe is a direct quote of one of the NPCs. And they talk about how horrible it is to not have sunlight, to not have weather, to not have freedom, to be trapped down here forever, and how they're just barely subsisting. If not for the fact that they were monsters, they'd probably have died out by now. Because remember, monsters are actually made of magic. They don't have physicality like humans do, so they don't actually need sustenance in the same manner that humans do. And then Papyrus. Papyrus, of course, is the ultimate culmination of the Snowdin section. Your first boss, your first real boss, Toriel didn't actually count. She was the Welk of this particular game. Papyrus is the first real boss. He was actually challenging him. I actually lost to him the first time because I refused to heal on the fight. And then finally I gave in on healing on the second fight. Papyrus is a teddy bear, right? I actually have a separate note of things on just Papyrus right here. First of all, right at the top of the thing, I have written totally friends. Because I would totally be friends with Papyrus in real life. He is just that kind of a guy I would like to get along with. He is lovable. He is dorky as hell. He is simultaneously very honest and yet extremely deluded. At no point is he the kind of character who would think to lie to you, to your face, and yet at the same time he's the kind of character who is so self-delusional about him and himself. Except even that is mentioned to be more of a self-reassurance thing, like we see later when he tries to help Alphys feel better about herself. It's not that he actually is like arrogant. It's that he is constantly reaffirming that he is awesome to bolster himself. And he is this lovable, dorky, wonderful idiot. And his song is perfectly him. It's bouncy, it's silly, it's earnest, and yet, as his pre-fight shows, as he talks about, you get the very strong impression Papyrus, for all his jubilant behavior, is a very lonely person. Someone who doesn't really feel like he really belongs with anyone, someone who doesn't really feel like he has any real friends, with the possible only exception of Sans himself. I mention this for two reasons. One, you'll notice that's kind of a trend of a lot of the characters. Papyrus, Sans, Undyne, and Alphys all are characters that are, and Toriel, and Asgore actually, are all characters that are very lonely and really feel like they're not connected to others. And by the time we finish going through here on the True Pacifist route, they'll all be friends with each other, in addition to friends with the protagonist. But there's a wonderful misdirection in the actual fight with him, by the way. So I mentioned the blue thing that I wanted you to remember. There's a thing all the way back with Doggo where he's like, blue attacks, you have to not move so that you don't get seen by blue attacks, which was a nice tutorial thing. And yet another bait and switch, because he's like, all right, I'm going to do my blue attack, and then he turns you blue, and it's like, what? And then you have to start doing the blue mechanic of jumping and getting through his attacks. And then he goes like, I'm going to do my super amazing special attack of Doom! And then Annoying Dog shows up and steals his bone. So he's like, okay, fine, here's a completely regular attack. And the completely regular attack is this, like, ridiculously huge, complicated attack of Doom that is incredibly hard to dodge. The first time I actually managed it, I was like, oh my god, that was awesome. And of course we find out a few other things about Papyrus as we move forward into the date sequence, which is hilarious, by the way. I don't have much to say about the dating sequences other than what it tells about the characters. And I've already said much about Papyrus as a character himself. But two things about it. First of all, it's interesting to note that Papyrus actually watches the Mettaton show. That'll actually come in later, believe it or not. Sort of. And second of all, it was really... There's a couple of things I really like. He mentions how, he'll have hedges trimmed into his faces, and how someday he actually wants to drive a real human car with the wind in his hair and all that fun stuff. Both of these things actually come true in the True Pacifist ending. And I loved it because I saw it and I was like, oh, dude, do you remember? I'm weird and I'll remember stupid little things like that, even on a first playthrough. But all of the date sequence and his ridiculous, oh, no, I will be the best friend ever, and I will do all this stuff for you. Oh, my God, you're already wearing clothes. Total lack of understanding. And yet, it was all worth it to get his phone number. Why? Because I've played Paper Mario. Can anyone guess why I use Goombario in Paper Mario 1 or Goombella in Paper Mario 2? Universally, as like my only companion I ever use? I'll go ahead and tell you. It's because in every screen on the entire game of both games, with some very few exceptions, you can talk to them, and they'll give you a little lore tidbit about where you are. And that's what Papyrus does with his phone number. One of these days, I plan to find a list of like everything he says in every zone, all 256 screens of the zone, or of the game, and just be like, aha! So that's Papyrus. So we beat Papyrus. Now, one other thing I find interesting is that Flowey talks to Papyrus. Now, this is interesting because it's mentioned that that's not new. That Papyrus is one of the only characters Flowey has talked to regularly. I always got the impression that Flowey was more positively inclined towards Papyrus than he was anyone else. Because Papyrus is just that kind of a lovable individual. Even though he probably killed him more than a few times, he's the kind of one he would go out of his way to interact with more often than not. He's probably more fun to interact with, too. Then we see another camera in the waterfall. That's nice. Like I said, we're just kind of going through linearly here. Undyne's build-up is, again, yet another bait and switch, because she's presented, we don't even know she's a she at the first, she's presented as this terrifying dark knight. I mean, it's like Golbez himself has just shown up. We don't even hear a voice for Undyne at first, just doom, doom. And, and the misdirection and the misdirection on top of the misdirection is basically the exact same thing it was with Sans in reverse. She wants to kill you, but she doesn't actually want to kill you. She hasn't really realized, what kind of a person you are yet, as opposed to Sans, who was basically promised not to kill you, and then there's some other situations with that. Also, just a little tidbit of a note, right about this point in the game, as we're going to the waterfall section, that's when I first noticed Flowey following me. God, that creeped me out. So the waterfall trash section is awesome. We find out this is Alphys' spot later on. She's in her element, I believe is how she phrases it. And that is very appropriate for a number of reasons. First of all, the monsters don't view garbage the way we do. Given that they don't seem to have biological refuse like we do, it probably also doesn't smell like our garbage pits do. It's probably just more plastic, metal, wood, just junk, as opposed to, trash. But I mention that because the game never says it flat out, but I always got the very strong impression that Alphys was going to commit suicide there. That she went there to hang out, and she was found staring into the abyss, wondering what was down there, when Undyne found her. And that's the first time Alphys and Undyne actually interacted with each other, and when their crush started, and when they started getting close to each other. And of course, there's a DVD there with claw marks desperately trying to get to it, an anime DVD, of course. The Mad and the Glad dummy is hilarious in Pacifist and vulnerable in Genocide. It's funny because in the Pacifist, he is incredibly inept. You literally hit him with his own attacks. In Genocide, you can one-shot him because he suddenly has a physical form and he's actually capable of being damaged. Yeah. And then we see Napstablook again. I wish I had more to say about Napstablook. All I have to say is that I've known people like that, and his self-esteem issues are very apparent and on display. I absolutely took his invitation to hang out and laid down on the floor with him, of course, and became one with the universe. And also, I feel bad for him, because if you think about it, he's actually lost all of his cousins, who it's mentioned he was pretty close to. The dummies, of course, and Mettaton, or whatever Mettaton used to be called. Actually, I don't even remember what that is off the top of my head. And then, of course, there's the snail farm, which I mentioned because Toriel is mentioned as being a regular customer there. If you're wondering why I keep pointing out little stuff like this, it's to show. I'm trying to show you. Like, I thought about it as I was going through this. This game is perfect for a lore run. Because the whole point of a lore run format is to show you on the screen here. Rumination is more for analysis after the fact. Lore run is more for, look here, and look how this connects, and look how this connects. But since I'll never play this game again, I actually can't do that. So this is the closest I'm getting. So I'm pointing out little details so you understand how the pieces connect. and how much effort and thought was put into this game. The over-encouragement thing was a nice touch, too, actually, and a subtle little point, if you will. If you encourage the snail too much, he's like, no. If you encourage him way too much, he bursts a flame. So on the one hand, it's a joke, obviously, but on the other hand, it fits so many of the characters of this game, doesn't it? That if you over-encourage them, you end up doing them a disservice. That you end up pushing them too hard, because now, I mean, that's easy to understand, isn't it? Imagine if you're encouraged and like, yeah, and then people keep encouraging you and keep encouraging you and keep encouraging you, and now there's pressure to succeed. Now you're stressed. Now you're like, oh God, and then you become paralyzed, and you can see how this falls through. I like how Monster Kid is a part of Undyne's tale no matter which playthrough you're going through. On the Genocide route, he is pretty much the impetus for her discovering the true depths of her determination, and on the Pacifist route, he is the thing that helps her to see the beginnings of what you really are, aka, not a horrible person. This is probably one of the bigger divergence points. Oh, actually, I want to say one other thing really quick. It's also worth noting that Monster Kid to Undyne is very clearly what Undyne to Garon was, and probably to Asgore as well. Garon's the turtle guy who's a vendor in the waterfall area, and he mentions stuff about this and how Undyne used to follow him around as a kid. So, Undyne the Undying is an awesome fight with some awesome music, of course. I've never fought it, obviously. But it's very wonderfully misdirected, because at first she appears to be a dark, brooding, Batman-esque character, a brooding misery guts, as I believe it's been called. I will tell you the horrible tale that has led to this thing. But it turns out she's not a dark, broody, mysterious character at all. She is a loud, boisterous, blatant, blunt, charisma of 2 kind of a character. She is not cool as is usually defined. She is more a kind of a character. And I love how the game actually just flat out is like, no, screw all that. Yeah! Another bait and switch, by the way. She is very much an extrovert, which is actually funny to me, because I've often said that people whose personalities match, rather than people with identical personalities, are the people who tend to get along together well in a long-term relationship. I mention that because I actually do think that Alphys and Undyne's personalities match each other quite well. So, I have to admit something, and I mentioned this earlier. This was one of the other points I got stuck. I was just sitting there on the Undyne fight like, come on. You have to run from her. At no point did it occur to me that I could run from her. And the chat, because I was streaming live, my first playthrough, the chat had to be like, Lore, dude, you can run. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll run. It is funny to me how Undyne's worldview just kind of breaks under your kindness. You could tell this is someone who has been psyching herself up to kill the evil, horrible human, to save all the people and be this wonderful hero, and, well, it's just this kid who's really nice and smiles and is offering me friendship, and, well, I don't know how to deal with this, but no, I'll kill you, but okay. Once again, I don't have too much to say about the date. The date is amazing. You're the guest! Bam! Don't get up! Just use the spear to point to what drink you want. Point to the blatantly obvious choice. And the whole thing. Yeah! Sure, there's a line. Hang on, I wrote it down. Our hearts are united against these healthy ingredients. Stab. So Undyne herself is basically eager energy, enthusiasm, all sorts of wonderful things like that. And, of course, a great deal of integrity. Or not integrity, I'm sorry, kindness is actually part of her. I know that sounds weird, but it is true. She reacts positively to your own kindness. She actually likes Papyrus, despite the fact that he's basically a total loser to her, because she wants someone that nice and that lovable to still be alive, to still actually be functional. And, of course, she gets along wonderfully with Alphys and her thing, so she is a very kind individual. And that's how I think Monster Kid is, the final way that Monster Kid is relevant to her storyline. Because Monster Kid is her, just with less experience. She's still that eager, happy, kind of a character underneath. It's just been built up around her, the years of bitterness and frustration and all the other dark things that she's had to deal with in her life. So age has tarnished her enthusiasm, but it has not removed it. And as she interacts with the protagonist and, more importantly, with everyone else, she slowly starts to become more and more herself. Probably culminating in the next date scene where she's with Alphys and she's like, yeah, you're awesome. It has been mentioned that she is also probably the most anime-inspired character in this work. But, you know. And now you have 2 phone options, so you can get 2 things when you go around. Woohoo! I wonder how long this rumination is so far. I only got a couple more pages, I swear. 2, 3. 3 more pages. So, let's fast forward a bit to the quiz fight with Alphys. Now, if you've seen my stream, you'll realize I'm an idiot, apparently. I didn't realize Alphys was actually helping at first. And she's like doing the little A, B, C thing with her hand. It's like, oh, that's what you're supposed to pick. Whoops. The quiz fight was fun, though. I also love the dog food in her room. And the letters. The letters are there, too, from all the families, wondering where their people have gone, the people that fell down. Where the heck are they? They're very subtle touches, and once again show that constructed in advance sort of a thing. And it makes me wonder something. I wonder if Alphys was this shy and this lacking in self-confidence before she became royal scientist and created Flowey and the amalgamates. I'm not sure, but I get this impression she wasn't this bad back then. Also, the Twitter thing as you're going through Hotlands is amazing. I have nothing else to add to it. It was just really nice. Lord knows we all tend to get a little over-enthusiastic about things we like. I'm no exception to that. And her little thing about Mew Mew 2 or whatever it's called was adorable. Excuse me. This is when I bring up the puzzles thing as a cultural norm thing, because this is actually the point at which several of the NPCs, normal everyday workers, start talking about how there's puzzles here, and there's always been puzzles here. And we find out through a couple other things that Undyne had to make puzzles, and Papyrus had to make puzzles, and Sans had to make puzzles. Again, that makes sense from the perspective that's being portrayed there. It also wouldn't surprise me the kind of thing that Mr. Asgore would have pushed for. What does that say? I can't read my own notes. Oh, right. It's interesting that most of the encounters with Mettaton as you're going through there, you can't actually really fail at it. If you do fail, something will happen to prevent things from going particularly bad, because Alphys is helping you the whole time. This is when we bring up Alphys' thing. I'm going to go ahead and talk about her now. She is wonderfully shy. I originally wrote introverted. I'm not sure if that's actually accurate, though. I don't have enough information. Because, see, here's the thing. There is a loner, someone who wants to be alone, and then there's an introvert, someone who doesn't want to be alone, but is different in the way they interact with other people, and generally wants things to be more private, more quiet. I'm not sure Alphys actually qualifies as either. I think she is shy, and I think she has no self-esteem, but I don't think she's actually introverted. I think she just hates herself. And that's something I can understand very well, especially from when I was younger. And actually I have a note here, I've known many people like Alphys in the past, including me. It is so very her, though. And so keeping in her perspective and her personality, that rather than approaching Frisk and saying, do you want to be friends? Or trying to, get along with them and interact with them or whatever, they engineer this complicated situation in which they will be seen as much better than they are. So Alphys will be perceived as this great hero, and that's the only way Frisk would ever be friends with her. Because she thinks so little of herself that mathematically she's already at like a negative 20, so she has to get all the way up to a regular 20 to make that happen. So she has to push 40 up in order to make her be perceived. She has to be this great grand hero, saving Frisk from this terrible death doom robot of destruction, and then Frisk will give her the time of day. Tell me you don't understand that personality. Tell me you don't understand where she's coming from. Now, granted, it's a little severe, and most of us don't have access to a death killer robot, but you get the point, don't you? How many of you out there have been so afraid to just be yourself when you try to approach someone, to be friends with them? How many of you out there have been trying, well, okay, maybe if I act like this, or maybe if I engineer this situation, they might be positively inclined towards me? It is thus very logical that she is so much more comfortable online than she is in person. She actually runs into the elevator just like, no, go away, just so that you don't actually, she doesn't have to talk to you in person anymore. And then it takes her like 4 or 5 rooms to get up the nerve to call you. I still have phone shyness to this day myself. I'm sure some of you understand that feeling too. And of course she was part of the human fan club, which is also awesome. The funny thing about Alphys is her shyness is not her only character trait. Her desire to constantly push herself is there too. Her desire to constantly be more and to accomplish more is part of her as well. Sorry, flipping ahead in my notes there. The spider donuts thing is amusing to me. I never actually got to fight the Muffet fight proper. Seeing the fight, it's actually a shame. It looks like a really fun fight, and a very unique fight. And of course gets back to the perseverance thing, because the whole point of that fight is you're just supposed to hang out. As long as you don't eat the donut in front of her, you're just supposed to hang out until someone's like, oh, by the way, he's actually not a horrible person. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Very fun fight. Although it's kind of terrifying in its own way. And then Mettaton sings an opera song. And based on the song and based on the way it's presented, I cannot help but think that that was inspired by FF6. I know. You hate me constantly talking about FF6. But seriously, you can't tell me Toby Fox, who is a fan of Earthbound as well, is not a fan of FF6 and wouldn't be inspired by one of the most famous video game scenes of all time in order to think that. Regardless, the puzzle room returns. You remember that from a while ago? The multicolored puzzle? That's probably one of the best parts about the Mettaton section in general. Okay, so the red tiles are this, and wait. Didn't we hear all these instructions like 100 rooms ago? You got it. We're good. Just go! And the best part is you can solve the puzzle. It's possible to do it in 30 seconds. It's hard, and if you do it, everything's like, okay, I guess you did it. And I've seen that cutscene. It's very amusing. I also like the cutscene where if you fail, where the flames are like, and then you're just like, and there's this awkward pause, and Mettaton actually coughs. And that's when Alphys finally leaps in to say, I'll save you, becoming more and more apparent that she's engineering this whole Mettaton thing as time goes on. The Mettaton fight, I'm going to take a slight aside here to talk about Sans and Toriel. I know that's a weird thing, but that's the order in which I saw things. Sans and Toriel both love bad jokes. An old friend of mine, very old friend of mine, once said that you can tell a lot about a person by how they react to bad jokes. Because most people who laugh at bad jokes are one of two kinds of people. They're either someone who looks at all of life as if it's a source of constant joy and amusement, or they're someone who lives a depressing, horrible life, and therefore constantly needs and derides joy and amusement from little things that shouldn't otherwise be funny. And honestly, I think that description, the second one, very clearly and adamantly points to both Sans and Toriel and the way they are and all that, you know. Anyway, so Mettaton fight, glorious in its overall presentation. It's also funny because it was actually probably the hardest fight for me personally in the True Pacifist run, and I want to talk about that later. I'm going to build up to that point. I've got a big point I'm going to talk about with that later. But you know, Papyrus was kind of okay. Undyne was certainly harder. Mettaton is getting even harder, and he actively, you know, he's trying to kill the crap out of you, and it's gloriously difficult, yet the really funny thing is that he is so much easier if you're doing Genocide route. You just one-shot him, and that's the end of it. That also fits that perspective, because as you go through the Genocide route, it gets easier and easier to kill. Honestly, there's only 2 fights that present any difficulty in the Genocide route. Let's just be honest about it. Undyne the Undying, which is pretty rough, and the Doom fight. Otherwise, the game actually gets easier as you go through. The difficulty ramp going down. So then we get to Asgore. Asgore is very... I don't have much to say about him, really. But he is definitely the kind of character who is bound by his own belief in his inability to do. He is an indecisive character, not very smart, very, very strong. It is emphasized many times that he is very powerful, and that is backed up by several facts. But he is not a strong leader. He is not a strong person in terms of mentally, in terms of emotionally. He is someone who, in a fit of rage, declared war, but then couldn't bring himself to follow through on that war. Toriel even calls him out on that. It's like, look, if you really wanted to go to war, you could have done it and been done with it years ago. You could have just ended it. You had that power to do that, Bob. You know, Asgore. And yet, so he just kind of huddles in his corner, so filled with shame and hiding behind that indecision. He's a very weak character. And I find that fascinating for what is effectively supposed to be the final boss. Because all of the game leading up to this point is presented in typical RPG fashion as if Asgore is the final fight, as if he's the Golbez of this game. Now that's appropriate because, spoiler alert for a game that came out in the 90s, Golbez is not the final boss of FF4. He is presented as he is all the way up until you finally free him, but he's not any more than Asgore is. I'm not claiming like Toby Fox is plagiarizing or anything. Don't read into that. The final area has so many obvious connections. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I got a couple things here. You know, obviously it's got connections to Toriel's home. Asriel is mentioned there. Chara is there. What I find very fascinating is the description. I mentioned this earlier. The description of things is different. I've heard a fan theory that the narrator of the game is Chara. And one of the biggest points of evidence for that is if you're on a full genocide route, when you go into the mirror, it says something like, it's still me. However, if you go into the mirror as Frisk in the true pacifist route, it says, despite everything, you're still you. And that ties into my overall big point that I'm leading up to as well, by the way. And then Asgore, it's so cool. It's actually his left hand. He destroys the mercy option. Just destroys it utterly. You cannot have mercy on him. Now, this is my first complaint about the game. I mentioned them all the way back to the beginning. I had 2 complaints about this game. Complaint number 1 is this. You have to fight Asgore. Those of you who watched my stream know what I did. I deliberately died. I refused. I was role-playing as myself, and I refused to kill someone. And so I just died. Then when I came, I'm like, okay, there's got to be a way around this. The game has not made me kill anyone this whole time. There's got to be a way to bypass this. So I die, reload, go back, and I notice that the talk to option is different. I'm like, aha, that's what's different. After the 9th death, that stops changing. And now I'm like, okay, I'm out of options. I'm out of ideas. I was asked, and I'll get into this later, I was asked to roleplay myself. So I was actually willing to die rather than to kill Asgore. And chat had to step in and say, okay, you have to fight him, but you don't have to kill him. And I'm like, fine, I'll go ahead and fight him. And that was the first time I'd ever done the fight mechanic in the whole game, was on Asgore. And then the overall theme continues. That theme I keep building up to. Because it's very difficult to spare Asgore. He destroys the mercy button. And then you have to fight him. But then when he's finally down and he's finally defeated and he's like, okay, you can kill me, then you can spare him. And knowing that doing so means giving up, means that's the end of the quest. And then Flowey destroys him. The Photoshop Flowey section is one of the more brilliant sections of the game, in my opinion. It's hard to really represent on YouTube or on stream and whatnot. I think I gave a pretty good presentation to my streamers when I was streaming it, because I was telling, I had it in windowed mode and I was showing everything that was happening at the time. So when the game crashed, or closed actually more accurately, I was like, oh my god, the game just closed. So I fired it up again. And it closed again, and I fired it up again. You get the point. So I could demonstrate what the game was doing to me, to fiddle with me as I was going through it. Once again, though, I don't really feel that's meta. I feel that's not even one layer meta. I think that's just demonstrating the fact that Flowey is taking control of the nature of the universe, which for us happens to be a game. But in Flowey's case, it's actually his world, so he's just kind of become the god of the new world. And then Flowey takes a potato chip and... sorry, I've lost track of thought here. Each kid that you encounter... I mentioned the gear thing, and you can track how far they got throughout the course of the game. All of that is brought through in the Photoshop Flowey fight. That's when so many of those color motifs come back together. And none of it's obvious. None of it's shoved in your face. You have to be paying attention. You have to notice what's happening on screen. You have to be picking it out of it, and I love that. Now, one really, really, really funny bit of trivia is that Frisk's save file is on, I forget the slot, it's like slot 1, I want to say. Flowey never saves over that slot. It's a very subtle point. The Omega Flowey fight, it's actually called Flowey X in the game files, and a lot of people call him Photoshop Flowey, is brilliant in basically every way. How many boss fights can you recall off the top of your head in a video game who use saving and loading a state as a mechanic to defeat you? Because Flowey does that. Flowey is a completely broken person. He is exactly what would happen, in my opinion, if you took a person who with no soul, in this case deprived as your ability to feel and touch the world around you, and removed that, but left the intelligence intact. In Kingdom Hearts terms, he's kind of like a nobody, if a nobody actually did have no heart, if they were completely disconnected from all that was around them, which obviously is not true in the Kingdom Hearts setting. And it's so horrifying. Flowey is a victim just as much as the rest of this. He's actually a victim of Chara, more specifically. He is... Like, there's one line he says where he's like, I want you to cry out in the darkness, go ahead. But nobody came. That's actually a bit of an arc word, because if you genocide, when you go in, when a combat starts, the text shows up, but nobody came. When Asriel died, and then basically through unusual methods became reincarnated as a flower, he was afraid and alone and scared, and he cried out into the night, but nobody came. Think about what he went through for a minute. It's even more horrifying, because as I mentioned, when you kill him in the genocide route, it is brutal. It is unremittingly just... Of course, and then he makes these wonderful comments about how you caused all these problems. You made them care about you. You cared about them. You are the one who is going to hurt them because you engendered these connections. If you don't care about someone, you don't hurt, is pretty much the message of what he's saying. And that rings true for a number of things, but I don't want to get into that just yet. It is funny to me that in that fight, with all that power at his display, the ability to control the world of Undertale, it was actually determination that ended the fight. That his determination was less than yours. And that's demonstrated by how you go through the fight, how you refuse to quit, how you keep trying to reach out to the kids that are in him, how you will reload the game if you lose and start again. You are actually determined to win. And in so doing, this is kind of meta, I'll admit, you present yourself as more determined than he is. You will always reload that game one more save to beat that boss than he will to beat you. And because you are more determined, remember the rule of Undertale, it's the person with the most determination that controls the save and the load. And so his ability to reload the state goes away. And then he is defeated. And then you give him mercy. I gave him mercy. And the best part was that he doesn't understand it at all. Because he doesn't have a soul, remember. So he doesn't understand things that are illogical. He understands things in a strictly intellectual fashion. So he threatens you. Threatening you will make you kill him. But you don't kill him. And he's just lost at that. Because that is a typical response. If I tell you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill everyone you've ever loved, then the logical response would be for you to attack me and destroy me in return. That is normal. That would be expected. But Frisk doesn't do that. And he cannot understand that concept. This is also building up to the big point. But all I'm going to say is that as Frisk, you have the power to reach out the hand, knowing you might be bitten in return. Just still building up to the big point. So then things get a little weird. The game kind of takes a pause. The game ends, but doesn't really. And now the pace jumps around a little bit. We have some silly things, we have some heartwarming things, we have some creepy things, we have some horrifying things, we have some heartwarming things, we have some epic things, and then a happy ending. The Alphys date is great. I love how she's been like, no, I've been saving items for our date, and it's all stuff for Undyne, every single one of it. She has a great line. They all say be yourself, but I don't know who myself is. I'd rather just be whatever makes people like me. I'm not going to go so far as to say that that's an overall theme of Undertale, but that line right there pretty much summarizes her character and many of the characters in a nutshell. I'd rather just be whatever it takes to make other people like me. How many of you sympathize with that one? Anime's real, right? I love it because then Papyrus, he's like, oh, you'll train me? No, I got someone better. Papyrus would actually be a lot better at training someone at having self-esteem than Undyne would. Especially since Undyne's self-esteem isn't actually that great either. Papyrus is a little higher. Then we go to the True Lab. So, the True Lab is where we reference something I mentioned all the way back at the beginning. Remember how I talked about non sequitur? The True Lab is a perfect example of how to properly execute the non sequitur, that musical note thing I mentioned earlier. Because it looks like a non sequitur at first. It looks like it's just weird for weird's sake. There's actually a trope for this, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's like the Disney acid trip sequence. You know, going back to like Bambi, and I'm sure there's other, older examples. Disney films usually have some kind of acid trip sequence of just blah going on. And as you're going through the True Lab, that's kind of what's happening there. I mean, the very way that you are attacked stretches and warps the UE, and things are just weird, and oh, God. But it's still well-executed non sequitur, because everything that's happening still fits the continuity, still makes sense in lore, once we find out who or whom the Amalgates actually are, and the true nature of their very being. And it's fits the overall tone of the entire game. Because once again, none of these things are evil. They are creepy, horrifying, just like Flowey was. But ultimately, they are victims. Not victims of malevolence or malice. Alphys wasn't some cackling mad scientist. She was trying to help people. And this is what came of it. These people whose physicality was not sufficient to withstand the determination literally melted into each other. And if you go back, you'll see several of these Amalgates are now hanging out with their family members. And their family are trying to get used to the fact that their family is now a blob thing. It also makes me wonder, because I wonder if just a little bit of determination would have worked better. One of the notes specifically says that it clearly indicates she was afraid. And she just kept injecting determination. This has to work. This has to work. I wonder if she literally flooded the monsters with too much determination, and that's what made the problem happen. Remember, we know what too much determination does to a monster. We see it in Undyne. When we kill her in the Genocide route, she starts to melt. Also, note the style of writing changes. Again, this just goes back to that leitmotif about text in the notebook entries. As she's writing initially, she's fully capitalized, fully punctuated, and then she starts getting freaked out. Capitalization goes away, sentence structure goes away. It's interesting to note that we get a few tidbits in the VHS things of just how messed up of a person Chara really is. This is really one of the only two times we really learn anything about Chara in the True Pacifist run. And then, of course, the whole idea of putting the determination, aka the will to live, into something that has no soul, that is neither a monster nor a person. It's implied, at least this is the way I perceive it, so Flowey was reborn, but he was reborn as a flower, right? I don't mean as a flower monster. I mean as a flower that just sits there and, converts sunlight or whatever they have down in the Underdark into energy and exists as a flower. Still self-aware, but no eyes, no mouth, no ability to communicate, no anything. Right? Hence the crying out for Mama and Papa, but nobody came, because he wasn't actually crying. No sound was being made. So that flower is picked, and then determination is added. That determination allows Flowey to be able to function as a being, and gives him access to the save and load. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out the obvious similarities between the determination extractor and Photoshop Flowey. Now, I wasn't sure if I was going to talk about this, to be completely honest. I was actually thinking it would be more appropriate not to talk about this. But if I didn't, all I would have is viewers saying, hey, you didn't talk about this, so let's talk about Gaster. I find it absolutely fascinating that Gaster has inspired more theories, more writing, more fan fiction, more fan art than any other character in Undertale, at least by my perception. I have seen so much discussion about a character who doesn't even exist, with that we actually aren't even sure that that sprite that we all assume is his sprite is his. We aren't even sure when they're referring to him or not. If you actually look at the factual evidence, and I had to do this for this rumination, the hints of Gaster are so vague that nothing is confirmed, with the one theoretical exception, and even that exception is just a strong connection, aka his name is W.D. Gasters, Winding's Gaster, right? And Windings is the font which is used for lab entry 17, which you can't even see unless you fiddle with the game files, by the way. Either entry 17, actually. So we actually know almost nothing about Gaster, and I think that's the point. If I was Toby Fox, I would never release more about Gaster. I would have him be present in other games, absolutely, I would do that. But I would not have him any more info about him in Undertale be released at all. He has captured so much imagination without ever existing, with just tiny little tidbits. And correct me if I'm wrong, but almost every single example of him, with I think 2 exceptions, is something you won't see ever, unless you fiddle with the game files. It's the only way you'll see it. Now, I have been asked, what's my theories on Gaster? But unfortunately, my theories on Gaster are very plain and vanilla. I think Gaster was the royal scientist along with Alphys and Sans. I think they were working together on a project of whatever import to try and change something, work on something. It doesn't even matter what. Then the incident of entry 17 happens, and Gaster is plastered across everything. He is warp-10'd, if you will. And in so doing, Gaster is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. And the best part is, the whole world goes on as if nothing happened. And the only one who's even aware he ever existed are A, Sans, I'll talk about him later, and B, his followers, who are also basically beta mobs. Now, one of the other interpretations I've heard several times is that Gaster is a meta commentary on beta mobs. For those who don't know what I mean by that, enemies, concepts, when we're going through an alpha and a beta of a game, not everything makes it to the final version, right? I mean, to use the movie term, some stuff ends up on the editing room floor. So Gaster is a monster that ended up on the editing room floor. And yet, to make the meta commentary, since, again, this is supposed to be presented as if this is a lore event. I talked about that, even in the Genocide route. So, even though we're playing a game, they're living a world. So what happens to the individual who is suddenly removed from his own setting? You get it? And of course, Sans is aware of this. I think this is probably the best part I can really talk about Sans throughout the course of this work. Really. Because, yeah, I wonder how long this has been so far. Poor Sans. I feel really bad for him. Megalovania is an awesome song and an awesome fight. That's all I'm going to say about that. I have heard several theories about Sans. Some people call him Sans, by the way. I'm bad with my A's. Okay, I'm sorry. Also, he definitely lost Gaster, and I'm pretty sure he remembers Gaster, but there's no clear evidence of that. It's just implied that he remembers Gaster. That being said, I have another theory, which is kind of more horrifying. What if he doesn't remember Gaster? What if he just remembers that he lost something? What if he remembers that there was something he lost, and so he knows his memory has been altered, but he doesn't know what it was altered to, or how it was altered? It's kind of more horrifying, because then you're aware that something's gone, but you don't know what. Sans... There's 3 things about Sans that I find fascinating as a character. First of all, let me go and give the theory out. I don't think he survives from shift to shift. I don't think he is aware of each load state. I think he is aware of the fact that load states can and do happen. I think that's what's happening. I think he is aware of the fact that things can at a moment change. And he is aware of the anomaly, of course. Now... And of course, this is something that's informed in his character constantly. He has the ability to warp space in a way, to bypass the way things naturally work. He is also presented as extremely lazy. But he isn't. He's just incredibly defeated. And that's an easy perspective to have, isn't it? I want you to imagine, real quick, I want you to imagine right now that you know, at any point in time, that someone else on Abu Gandhi or whatever, Abu Dhabi, excuse me, or in outer Mongolia, could hit a load state to 3 years ago. And you would just lose the last 3 years of your life. You'd have to start it over again. And imagine, again, if my earlier theory is correct about him remembering that he lost something, what if he isn't aware of the shifts, but what if he's aware of the fact that a shift happened? Wouldn't that be even worse? Because then, all of a sudden it's 3 years ago, you don't know that it's 3 years ago, but you're just suddenly aware that you just lost something, that something just shifted. And over time, you feel more shift as other people load state, until it gets to the point where you just don't care about anything anymore, where you just give up. Because there's no point in anything, because someone else is just going to walk along and undo it. Just like that. How would that feel? He's not lazy. He is horribly depressed. And two other things I want to point out about him. First of all, I don't think he, like I said, I don't think he is aware of all the events of a previous load. But I do think he's basically Batman. Hear me out. One of the things Batman is most known for, possibly to a ridiculous degree in some cases, is his ability to plan ahead. I think that's Sans in a nutshell. There's so many instances, the code you get from him is actually a great example of this, where he talks about it and he's like, yeah, he's the kind of person who would in advance, like way in advance, come up with this programmed code that he could tell someone so that they could tell him. So if anybody ever tells him that code, you get the point. He just plans in advance knowing that these load states are happening and knowing that they might affect things so that he has backups upon backups in portrayal and ready for that. Finally, of course, and then of course, like even when you fight him, if you lose to the Megalovania fight, when you come up to him, he's just like... It's implied that in lore, Chara, the main character, looks like, all right, I'm going to get you this time. You could just see that on Chara's face. And so for Sans, this is the first time he's fought you. But he looks at the way you're approaching and he's like, this is not the first time you've fought me, is it? And he can understand that, and that changes his dialogue. Which is some great gameplay mechanic, by the way, in general. Actually, the note I wrote here was that he has pre-planning that would make Batman blush. The final note I want to say about Sans is that he's not powerful. In fact, he's the weakest monster in the entire setting. But he is also the deadliest. This is a concept I love in fiction when it's properly applied, because the application of power is what matters. Asgore is the most powerful. And yet, as I mentioned, he is the weakest. He has the weakest will, the weakest intellect, the weakest blah, 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 blah. Sans is on the opposite end of that spectrum. The real final boss, if you will, which is actually the player character, but I already mentioned that. Because I've said it before, I've had this theory for a long time that Sans is basically the main character at that point, and you are the final boss, and the way the Megalovania fight goes makes me think that, but I don't want to get too much into that. Sans is the application of power. He'll only hit you for one. He'll hit you for one a lot, and he'll hit you for one in ways that's hard to avoid. His application, his intelligent use of power, makes him so much stronger than he would otherwise be. This is why I try to make that clear distinction between strength and power, or strength and total output, or whatever you want to call it, because that matters for reasons like Sans here. In a one-on-one on-paper fight, Asgore would beat the crap out of Sans. He only has 1 health, basically, after all, and 1 damage. And yet, if Sans was fighting Asgore full out, Sans would obliterate Asgore. You see the difference? I do feel very badly for Sans, though. So then we reload. We go up. Asgore's like, let us fight. But before he can do anything, Toriel knocks him away. And remember, I told you to remember this. She knocks him away just like she knocked away Flowey at the beginning of the game. And she says the exact same words that she said to Flowey all the way back at the beginning of the game. Which, in addition to being a nice bookend, and a fake bookend, I'll talk about that in a moment, is a nice way of showing just how little she thinks of Asgore at this point in time. And I don't blame her. I mean, Asgore's kind of a bastard at this point. And I'm sure she's lost all respect for him, like, in general. The reason I mentioned the bookend as a nice thing is because this is like a quadruple bait and switch. It's like, it's presented as if, having gone through the whole game up to this point, you now don't have to fight the final boss. That fits the true pacifist playthrough. Not a non-final boss being the last encounter makes sense for an encounter where you haven't killed anyone, right? It's the kind of thing I would have expected the first time through, actually, in the neutral playthrough. You know, not having to fight Asgore. So that's the first. Then Flowey shows up, and he's like, "Aha! I will take everyone. This is all a trap by me." But then Flowey goes to kill you, and all the people defend you from it. So now it's back to the friends are my friends are my power thing, except better than Sora. And then it goes back into there being a real final battle, and then, so I guess we're up to 5 here, you can't lose the final fight. You cannot lose to Asriel Dreamer. He will just reform each time. I love it. I absolutely love it. So Flowey's return, you don't fight all that, and you can't lose. And the final boss fight, I mentioned this with regards to Megalovania as well, and Photoshop Flowey, actually. The wonderful thing about Photoshop Flowey, if I can diverge just for a second to talk about that, is that it's the Madoka Magica effect. In other words, when you're doing a visual medium, you want to literally show something that is wrong, that is off, so you show it in a completely different format. In Madoka Magica, that was the Witch's Labyrinths, right? In here, it's Photoshop Flowey. He's not done in sprites in the typical sense of the word. He's not done in pixel art. He's this weird, pulsating, organic flower photo, disgusting, horrible thing, and he just doesn't fit the normal confines of the game. And that's done on purpose to emphasize him. Asriel Dreamer, then, similarly doesn't fit the normal confines of the game, but in a different way. Whereas Photoshop Flowey was wrong, completely doesn't fit in Undertale, Asriel Dreamer completes Undertale by including all aspects of it. All the musical tones with the leitmotifs that I mentioned earlier, the visual representation of each of the colors that I mentioned within regards to that, the fact that throughout the fight you cannot lose, the fact that as you're going through the fight you have to constantly be reaching out to him and saving, using the save thing. There's a great line. Seems like you're saving your game really is impossible, but with little power you have, maybe you can save something else. That was such a great line. I loved that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pause to talk about the second thing I didn't like about this game. You cannot save Asriel Dreamer, and I hate that. In a game where you can save everyone, where you can have mercy on Flowey, for God's sakes, let me save Asriel Dreamer, you know? Let me save that poor, poor boy who died at way too young of an age in a tragic and pointless circumstance, just as another pawn in someone else's wicked and twisted game. But no, the best I can do is give him a hug. But this brings me to the final point, the big point about Undertale. This is my big one right here. As you go through the game, as you go throughout the course of Undertale, it gets harder to do it. Both sides. On the Genocide route, I know several players who basically reached, say, the Undyne fight, and they had to stop. They couldn't go anymore. That was too much. And I've seen several players go through the Pacifist run and get about to Mettaton, is usually around where that happens, sometimes around Asgore, and they gave up. They had to stop, and they had to kill, right? This is one of the biggest reasons why neutral playthrough is the most common first playthrough of this game, no matter what you're going for. Especially if you're playing it properly, aka playing it in ignorance. It gets harder on the Genocide route because you see more and more what a monster you're becoming. But that's all I'm going to say about that. I just want to leave that aside. What I really want to talk about is the Pacifist route, because it gets harder and harder to do it. And I've been pointing out this theme constantly. The whole game has been building up to this. Because when you start off, it's easy to spare them. A kindly, loving mother character? You're not going to want to kill her. If at best you might do it by accident or because you don't think you have a choice. Then you get to Snowdin. You remember I pointed out that thing about Snowdin? It's this light, fluffy, happy area. Kind-hearted. You get an insight into the monsters and their characters and their personality and their plights. And what are the enemies you fight here? You fight puppies! The enemies in the Snowdin area are puppies. Think about it. Then you move on a little bit more, and the first boss is Papyrus. And he's easy to spare. I'm not going to go through the whole steps. I kind of already have. But as you go through the game, it gets harder and harder to really have a reason to spare them, as they get more determined. Undyne seemed clear in her belief that you needed to die, and you actually can't spare her. All you can do is run from her. Mettaton, again, another example of where it becomes very, very difficult to spare him, and actually, unless you meet certain circumstances, you don't spare him at all. Asriel, who you can't spare at all unless you first defeat him, and then Photoshop Flowey. All this way through the game, it's been getting more and more difficult to spare the enemy, right up until Photoshop Flowey. Photoshop Flowey is arguably the moment at which the game reaches its thematic crux. From this point on, you are 100%, because you are confirmed during the Photoshop Flowey fight. You know why? Because it's been harder and harder to save them, but you've always had one trick up your sleeve: the save. You could load state, and Lord knows I did when I screwed up. I bet some of you did too. You always had that back pocket. You always had that one little thing you could do to fix the situation and say, nope, I'm going to do it again. And that's taken from you. And then, when you have nothing, when you have no power to back you up, then you are told, are you going to reach out or not? Are you going to try and reach out a hand and spare someone when you have no strength left to back up the decision if they hurt you? Because it's easy to help others when you have the power to back up. That is the point of power. I've talked about that so many times in so many of my works and in my real life. You have power, that means you can accept it when they hurt you. When they will hurt you. When you reach out a hand to someone. You can eat it. You've got the HP, if you will, to eat it because you have that power. But when that power is taken from you, that is when it is much more difficult to reach out that hand and say, here. And that is the point of this game. I told you at the beginning that I was asked, or that I asked my viewers, if I should let them decide, or if I should roleplay myself. If I should play this as if I was Frisk. And they voted for me to play it as myself. And that's why I'd rather die than kill Asriel. And that's why I love this game so damn much. Because it reminded me of everything that helps me to go through every single day of this miserable planet. Is that even when you don't have power, you can still reach out that hand. I'm sorry. I didn't plan to cry. Oh. Because it's worth it. The Aesop, if you will, is that it is not easy to do something like that, to do the right thing, to be a good person, to have friends, to have family, to be kind. It's not easy. It's hard. But it's worth it. Don't mind me, guys. Don't mind me. I'll be okay. Somebody has to stay here and take care of the flowers.